Senator from Beaufort.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the way you've conducted these hearings, and thank you, Dr. Simmer, for your service. As you leave, I wanted to recognize that as well. What I wanted to do is give a little context for what I think is a proper way for us to assess this nomination, and I would start with my experience as Chief of Staff for Governor Sanford. And the unique interplay there is between the governor as chief executive and his cabinet. I speak in those terms because the governor, of course, is constitutionally charged with faithfully executing the laws. The legislature, in regard to those most important duties that he has to discharge, has created a cabinet structure. And the cabinet structure is unique because every single act by a cabinet director is directly imputable to that chief executive. And that is a conversation that when I was chief of staff, I had on a regular basis with cabinet directors. There's a theory in law called respondent superior, that the acts of one individual can be imputed as a matter of law to the superior or to the employer. In the political context, that arises in the context of an executive, chief executive, and a cabinet official. It's a very close relationship. It's a trusting relationship. It's one in which the governor has to have absolute faith in that cabinet director because ultimately that governor is going to be held accountable to the people of South Carolina for what that cabinet official does. So for that reason alone, that first reason, I approach any cabinet nomination with a tremendous degree of deference to the governor because what we're talking about is confirming an individual that is going to be essential to the governor discharging his constitutional duty in faithfully executing the laws. So there's a degree of deference or presumption, speaking in legal terms, that I give to the nominee. So he starts with that. Any nominee in the cabinet starts with that for me. Further to that, I think in terms of the Senate's role of advice and consent, because it's a very important role that we play. And one, quite frankly, that's rooted back in the Constitution that was ratified in 1789, which of course established the federal government and established certain officers that were cabinet officers who had to be nominated by the president, subject to advice and consent of the Senate. And our Constitution in South Carolina mirrors that to a substantial degree. The inspiration for our advice and consent provisions in the Constitution were inspired by that federal Constitution. So I think it's instructive to look at, and I'm going to steal some of Senator Campson's thunder here because I'm going to read from Federalist 76, which was published by Alexander Hamilton, who wrote with quite a degree of eloquence in regard to the governor's nomination powers and the Senate's role of advice and consent. And I'm going to go ahead and read from some of that Federalist paper. Speaking of the nomination by the governor and the degree of deference that is to be, the president in this case, to be provided to the executive, it reads as follows. I proceed to lay it down as a rule that one man of discernment is better fitted to analyze and estimate the peculiar qualities adapted to particular offices than a body of men of equal or perhaps even superior discernment. The sole and undivided responsibility of one man will naturally beget a livelier sense of duty and a more exact regard to reputation. He will, on this account, feel himself under stronger obligations and more interested to investigate with care the qualities requisite to the stations to be filled, and to prefer with impartiality the persons who may have the fairest pretensions to them. A single well-directed man, by a single understanding, cannot be distracted and warped by that diversity of views, feelings, and interests which frequently distract and warp the resolution of a collective body. Now, that isn't to say that the governor's nomination is absolute and not subject to discretion or review by the Senate. And Hamilton in this paper talks about that as well. What is the standard to be applied by the Senate in confirming? And it reads as follows. To what purpose then require the cooperation of the Senate? I answer that the necessity of their concurrence would have a powerful, though in general silent, operation. It would be an excellent check upon the spirit of favoritism in the president, and would tend generally to prevent the appointment of unfit characters from family connections, from personal attachments, or from a view to popularity. I think that is worth remembering as we go about this, twofold. One, we're talking about someone who has been nominated by the governor to help him discharge his constitutional duties, and a degree of deference is owed there. I also want to talk about what Hamilton said in regard to the governor being in a position of discernment, the governor being in a position of conducting background checks, vetting, because he is ultimately going to be the one held responsible for what that person does. Now, I would frame the issue of confirmation, at least in my mind, as this. Is there credible evidence that we have before us for the proposition that Dr. Simmer is not qualified to assist the governor in discharging the laws as they pertain to public health in South Carolina? Now, there's been a lot of talk in regard to his emphasis on vaccines, or his passion for seeing South Carolinians to receive the vaccine, I guess back in 2021. If that be an error in judgment, or if that be something that makes him unqualified or unfit, I am guilty of that, because I spent several months in 2021 helping my constituents find out what pharmacies had, and I suspect all of us were. Remember the portals that were developed by DHEC and the difficulty of navigating those portals and trying to find pharmacies that had the drug and trying to communicate with DHEC in regard to how to allocate that vaccine. I was integrally involved in that. I think a lot of my time in 2021 was spent in that regard, because at that point in time, you had President Trump with Operation Warp Speed. You had the vaccines being administered. I mean, I don't remember. There may have been some pushback in those days in 2021 in regard to the vaccine, but there wasn't a lot. There wasn't many. I mean, the overwhelming response I got from my constituents was, where can I go to get it? Now, so to the extent that he undertook, and speaking of Dr. Simmer now, of efforts to encourage people to take the vaccine or facilitating them taking the vaccine, if he's guilty of some dereliction of duty in that regard, then I am derelict as well, because I spent a lot of time in that regard. I helped. Not only in regard to that, I helped in regard to the testing, setting up mass testing events. I mean, I spent a lot of time doing that. Now, as to what he actually did during his tenure as DHEC director and now as interim, let's just speak of DHEC director, because I think most of the comments about his actions relate to that. You're talking about a DHEC director that was operating at all times under a continuing executive order, emergency order, issued by the governor. Now, we can debate whether or not that was proper, and I think we should debate, because I don't think we ever intended for those executive orders to be in perpetuity. But nonetheless, they were in effect, and they very precisely defined the parameters in which he, the governor, expected his officials to act. And I'm not aware, I mean, and there was some talk in regard to there was a disagreement between the governor and Dr. Simmer, or Dr. Simmer expressed frustration or aggravation or whatever it might be. I think the short answer to that is, if that existed, then he wouldn't have put him back before us now for nomination. I mean, I think that's the truest indication of whether or not he was conforming with what the governor wanted done. The senator from Oconee talked about the consent of the governed, and that is the way a representative constitutional republic operates. You have to have the consent of the governed for legitimacy. But that consent is conferred by elections, okay? That consent is conferred by the election of a chief executive, and that chief executive exercising his power to appoint officials. That's the consent of the governed. It isn't what you might read on social media. It isn't what you might receive through phone calls from constituents. The consent of the governed notion that is so critical to a representative form of government are elections. And we are talking about a nomination made by a duly elected chief executive of the state. We're talking about confirming somebody who he believes is best suited to assist him in discharging his constitutional duty. I understand that there are some, we get to granular detail about vaccines and informed consent and all those things, but at the end of the day, do you truly think that the governor is in clear error? Do you think that he truly has put forward somebody who is unfit, who is not qualified, who doesn't have the competency?
The sergeant will clear this room. We'll maintain the decorum. Sergeant, next outburst.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have not heard anything that dissuades me from the opinion that the governor didn't exercise reasonable discretion in this regard. I have looked at Dr. Simmer's record, both educationally, professionally, militarily, in terms of public health. At the end of the day, we have a three-part system of government. We make the laws, we can establish standards, the governor executes them. The governor is entitled to deference in regard to the individuals he selects to help him execute that constitutional duty. And in the absence of clear and unequivocal proof that a man is unfit or a man is incapable or a man is not able to discharge that, I think we owe that deference to the governor. So because I approach it in that manner, Mr. Chairman, I intend, when the vote comes, to move this forward so that the entire Senate has the ability to pass upon this nomination, so that the entire Senate, and we represent, less than half of it here. But from my standpoint and from my personal experience as chief of staff for a governor who worked with cabinet directors, who understands that intimate relationship between a governor and a cabinet director, I am reluctant, based on what's been put before us, to say nay to the governor, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator from Berkeley, Senator Fernandez.